If you're shopping for a Creality 3D printer this Christmas, they're good machines, but Creality has made it very, very confusing. Whether you're looking at an Ender 3 V2, an Ender 3, or an Ender 3 Pro, or even a CR6. There's differences from older machines to new machines. If you watch some of my old videos, some of the stuff like bed level or filament change won't work properly on some machines. Well, Creality really messed things up. Let me explain it so you understand what you're buying on today's Filament Friday. Filament Friday is brought to you every week by the generous donations of these Patreon supporters. This video is also brought to you by PCBWay.com, a great place to get low-cost circuit boards and also low-cost assembly services, all from one place, PCBWay.com. I've been using the Ender 3 since it first came out. I got one of the first units, and frankly it wasn't that great, but I made it better over time and I shared those videos. And then they came out with the Ender 3 Pro. The Ender 3 Pro had a better power supply, a magnetic bed, and a few other changes. I did a video comparing the two. I'll put a link to that up here. But then along the way, they eventually came out with the Ender 3 V2, which has a lot of upgrades that I like: glass bed, adjusters, and a 32-bit board. And that's where things got confusing. Because at the same time, they came out with this, the CR6, and this they did as a Kickstarter. And this one is one I got to show for the Kickstarter, and it has an 8-bit board. But if they sold enough on Kickstarter, they would upgrade everybody to a 32-bit board, similar to what this has. And that's what they ended up doing, so everyone got 32-bit boards. Now, some of those boards had some flaws in them that actually caused some circuit malfunctions that smoked the board. It was a small percentage, but it happened. I couldn't test it because I have an 8-bit board version. And so things got confusing there. And then it gets even more confusing because they switched all their Ender and Ender 3 Pro, just the standard Ender and Ender 3 Pro, they switched those to 32-bit. But not the same as the Ender 3 V2 or the CR6. So now you've got multiple different machines with different boards, but they don't put any numbers on the machine so you know what you're buying. You can't see it in the box. You could actually go out right now and buy an Ender 3 and possibly get an 8-bit board, which was great, but you probably are going to get a 32-bit board, which is not as great because the firmware that they put in the 32-bit boards on the Ender 3 or Ender 3 Pro, or even the V2, it's not complete firmware. It's missing a lot of the features that Marlin offers, and Creality hasn't kept up the firmware that they offer for you to download and install. Now, fortunately, you can upgrade the firmware on these guys because they're using open source Marlin. And all the 32-bit boards have a bootloader in it. So changing the firmware means just putting in an SD card, starting the machine, it'll load a new file, and then update its firmware. But where do you get updated firmware? That's what I wanted to talk to you about. I found this site, and I'll put a link to it below. It's a Marlin site where this individual builds a new firmware for any of these machines every day. Now, it's a service you have to pay for, and in full disclosure, he gave me a free subscription so I could test it out, but it cost about $10.50 for the year. And you can download new firmware every day if you want. He's building new firmware every day for CR6, for Ender 3 V2, and for the Ender 3s. And also for some of the CR10 and some of those. So I highly suggest you check it out. I've been using it because I've tried to build my own Marlin firmware and it hasn't always worked out. I did a video on how to update Ender 3 V2 firmware, and I had to take my firmware down because it worked for me, but it didn't work for everybody else. So I just decided to let a third party handle it, and I gotta tell you, it's been working great. I've now brought my machines up to date, and my Ender 3 and Ender 3 Pros that 32-bit are now working great. But some of my older videos, like when you try to level the bed, I had G-code that would move the nozzle to each corner so you could level it. Some people complained that the nozzle wouldn't stop. It would go to the corner and then pick up, move to the next corner, pick up, go to the next corner. They never had time to put the paper in. That's because the Creality firmware released on the 32-bit boards doesn't recognize the M0 command. And that's the same command that I used and a lot of people use in the pause at height if they want to do two color or change filament. That's what it uses, and the firmware on the V2, the Ender 3, and the Ender 3 Pro weren't recognized. Also, if you use the Prusa slicer, where it uses an M600 to do a filament change, it didn't recognize M600. So the firmware that you get with your machine is incomplete on the 32-bit. Now, if you get an 8-bit board, then everything works fine. The firmware is up to date and working, but it's harder to get those. So how do you know which board you have? Well, that's where the circuit board is supposed to tell you by the version number. Now it says version 4.2.2 on all the Ender 3, Ender 3 Pro, and Ender 3 V2s. But they're different. Ender 3 V2 is version 4.2.2, but has silent drivers, which is really nice. But Ender 3 and Ender 3 Pro have a same version 4.2.2, but they have 4988 drivers. In fact, they're HR 4988. They're not even the actual 4988 originals. So your machine is noisier. So how do you know if you have the latest or not? You can't tell because there's no other indicator, and you can't easily pull these heat sinks off and see what number is on the chip to determine what you have. So another way to do it is to upgrade your board to the 4.2.7, and I did a video on that. That's the board that's in the CR6. But some of those had that problem with the driver that would actually smoke. Well, apparently that's all been fixed. So now you can buy a 4.2.7 board which has the silent drivers, which is the same one in here, and then you can get the updated firmware from that Marlin site that I'm referencing. So do you update your machines with a new board? That's really your call. You can try out his firmware, but now at least you know what you're buying. If you get an 8-bit board, it'll say version 1.1 point something. Version 1.1.4 is typically the board that's out there that has the 4988 non-silent drivers. If you get a version 1.1.5, it's probably not going to be on the machine, but you can get those from third party. Those have these silent drivers. I know this can sound very confusing, but it's really not that tough. The whole idea is that the firmware that you get with your Ender 3, Ender 3 Pro, or V2 that's currently shipping with 32-bit boards, version 4.2.2, you probably should update the firmware to the latest version, and I highly recommend this Marlin site. It's going to cost you a little extra, $10.50, but for the year, so that's pretty cheap. That's less than half the cost of a good spool of filament. And then you've got firmware, the latest firmware direct from Marlin. That's why he builds every day. Any bug fixes, he picks up new firmware. And if you go with the CR6, you can get the new firmware there too. And if you do end up updating to that 4.2.7, which is the board that's in here, which is the latest silent board from Creality, he has firmware for that as well. So if you get a new machine for Christmas, don't be frustrated that my board level G code isn't working, or you can't do 2-color prints, or some other thing isn't working right. Update your firmware and you'll probably find out that all of it starts working again. And speaking of circuit boards, if you're into electronics and you want to design your own circuit boards and also get them soldered together with components and everything, check out PCBWay. Not only do they offer low-cost circuit boards, but you can get them to assemble it through hole parts, surface mount parts, so you can give them the whole design. They'll build it up and ship it back to you. Gerber files, bill of materials, give it to them. They'll build it, ship it back to you at very affordable prices. So check out PCBWay if you want to build your own circuit boards. PCBWay.com. If you do decide to update the firmware on a 32-bit board for shut-off power, then copy his .bin file to an 8 gigabit or less SD card formatted to FAT32, and then just switch on power, and it'll automatically update, and you'll see the display go black for a while, and then it'll come up after about 30 seconds, and then you'll have updated the firmware. It's that easy. Hopefully this will make you a smarter shopper the next time you go out and buy a 3D printer, especially if you're getting one for Christmas. That's it for this week. If you like what I'm doing here, maybe check out some of the videos popping up, and if nothing else, click on that CHEP logo and subscribe. I'll see you next time right here at Filament Friday.